Something happens inside your brain almost every single night, and most people go their whole lives without ever being told what it actually is. Not because it's classified, because the man who found it wasn't even supposed to be looking for it. And the story of how he found it is still, quietly, missing half of what actually happened. You've probably grown up believing sleep is basically your brain switching off. Lights out, nothing happening, until morning. That's not close to what's actually going on in your head, several times a night, every night, whether you remember it or not. You've felt it before, that jolt of snapping awake mid-scene, like you were just watching something happen right in front of you, and for a second you're not even sure what was real. That's not random. There's a specific reason it happens. And we only know that reason exists because, in the winter of 1952, a graduate student ignored his assignment, hooked the wrong person up to the wrong machine, and noticed something on the paper that nobody had told him to look for. His name was Eugene Aserinsky. In 1950, he was a graduate student with, by his own account, no real specialty and no real plan, who ended up, somewhat reluctantly, in the lab of Nathaniel Kleitman. If you worked in physiology at the University of Chicago in 1950, you already knew who Kleitman was. He had built, from nothing, the world's first sleep laboratory. A cot pushed under a repurposed fume hood in a building never designed for sleeping at all. He had spent nearly 3 decades trying to answer a question everyone around him considered already settled. What actually happens to a person while they sleep? And the answer, as far as the science of the time was concerned, was almost nothing. You've probably never questioned that idea yourself. Most people haven't. But neither did the scientists studying sleep in 1950. Sleep was an off switch. The brain went quiet. The senses went quiet. Nothing of interest happened again until the person woke up. It was, more or less, the same model the ancient Greeks had used, who pictured sleep and death as brothers. Kleitman assigned his new student a project that matched exactly how uninteresting sleep was assumed to be. Sit with sleeping infants and count how often their eyelids blinked. It was not a glamorous assignment. By Aserinsky's own later account, it felt closer to a punishment than a purpose. Hour after hour, night after night, watching for a twitch that told you almost nothing. After months of this producing almost nothing worth reporting, Aserinsky made a decision that wasn't really his to make. He stopped studying infants. He started using something the lab already had lying around, an early electroencephalograph, a machine that traced the brain's electrical activity onto long rolls of paper, sometimes half a mile of it in a single night, and he began wiring up adult subjects instead, including, on more than one night, his own young son. The machine ran all night, scratching its long, repetitive lines onto paper while the subject slept in the next room. For most of the night, the lines stayed exactly as boring as everyone expected sleep to be. Then, several times over the course of a single night, the pattern would change. The lines would suddenly turn fast and irregular, almost identical to the pattern the machine produced when the subject was wide awake. At the same moment, Aserinsky noticed something even stranger happening at the corners of the sleeper's closed eyes. Rapid, sweeping movement, back and forth, exactly the motion of someone watching something move in front of them. Except their eyes were shut, and by every outward sign they were still completely asleep. It happened again the next night, and the next, always in short bursts, always several times across 8 hours. Always with that same unmistakable spike in brain activity, breathing, and heart rate. So Aserinsky and Kleitman did the obvious thing. They started waking people up in the middle of it and asking them what they'd been doing. Almost without exception, the answer was the same. They'd been dreaming, vividly, specifically, mid-scene. Wake someone during the quiet part of the night, and they usually told you nothing. Wake them during one of these strange bursts, and they could describe in detail exactly what they'd just watched happen inside their own head. If you've ever startled awake and could still picture exactly where you were and what you were doing, that specific feeling is the same thing this experiment proved was real, in a lab, on paper, for the first time in recorded history. Sleep, it turned out, was not one thing. It was a cycle, moving the body and brain through distinct stages, and in one of those stages, several times a night without exception, the brain lit up almost as if it were awake, while the body stayed still and the eyes moved like they were tracking something real. They published the findings in the journal Science in 1953. A junior colleague who later joined the lab, William Dement, would give the phenomenon the name it still carries today: rapid eye movement sleep, REM. Before this, dreaming had barely been treated as a scientific subject at all. A private, unverifiable report, more the territory of psychoanalysts on a couch than physiologists in a lab. Aserinsky and Kleitman's discovery gave dreaming a physical signature, a stage, a timestamp, something you could watch happen on paper, in real time, in anyone. It reframed the entire premise of sleep itself. Sleep wasn't the brain switching off. It was the brain cycling through active and quiet phases all night long, doing something during the active phases that we still don't fully agree on. Nearly every modern sleep study, every diagnosis of a sleep disorder, every question we still ask about why we dream at all, traces back to that one wired-up night in a Chicago lab. But here's the part almost every retelling of this story leaves out entirely. Decades later, long after both men's careers were effectively over, Aserinsky wrote his own account of what had happened that year. In it, he described Kleitman's involvement as tangential, peripheral. He said he'd had genuine reservations about listing Kleitman as a co-author on the original paper at all, despite Kleitman being his supervisor, his lab, and the source of the decades of groundwork that had made the entire study possible in the first place. By the time Aserinsky wrote this, Kleitman was still alive. He would go on to live to 103, but he was already past 100 years old, and there is no record of what he thought about being quietly written out of a discovery that had carried his name for 40 years. Aserinsky died in 1998. Kleitman outlived him by a year. No one alive today can tell you, with any certainty, whose insight it actually was. The version we're usually taught is the tidy one. A curious scientist noticed something strange, and medicine was never the same. What actually happened is messier. A bored graduate student on a punishment assignment, quietly ignoring his instructions, wiring up the wrong subjects with equipment nobody told him to use, and stumbling into something neither he nor his supervisor fully understood until it was already in print. And even after the discovery was made permanent, made foundational to how we now understand roughly a third of every human life, the two men who made it spent the rest of their lives unable to fully agree on which of them had actually made it. Tonight, when you fall asleep, this exact same thing is going to happen inside your head. Several times, whether you remember it in the morning or not. Maybe that's the part worth sitting with. We like our discoveries to have a single author, a single moment, a clean line from question to answer. But most of them don't work that way. Most of them are built by more than one person in a room at 3 in the morning, neither one fully certain decades later which parts were really theirs. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, the channel's called Umbra, and this was only the first one. Subscribing means the next story finds you instead of the other way around. And if someone you know would find this as strange as you just did, send it their way. I'm genuinely curious, though. Aserinsky or Kleitman, who do you think actually deserves the credit? Tell me in the comments.